Hey everyone, it's Kim.
It's Mark, and welcome to the Powerstack Interview.
We're excited to be here all with you again. We've had so much fun doing the last couple of interviews, one including Jeff Curry on the concept of energy hoarding and the Strait of Hormuz, the most recent one being with Mike Schrepp, the ex-CTO of Meta and his new climate fund, Gigascale. And so we wanted to keep this interview momentum going. Let us know what you think, the format, the content, the guests. We're trying something new and we want to make this exciting and interesting for you all. So we'd love to hear from you. And we also have some exciting news before we kick off. Literally a couple of days ago, we just announced that our market intelligence product, Sightline, the company behind this whole thing, just relaunched as Currents, where we are combining the speed of AI with the trust of expert research. And we're really pointing that engine at this wild west that is the AI power demand. And we hear about it day in, day out, right? Unprecedented load growth that's hitting the grid as we speak. But the actual tactics of how we bring those firm megawatts online, especially clean firm megawatts, is still a bit of an open question. And an open question that, Mark, as we know, we've been spending a lot of time on the team thinking and talking about.
Tons. So if you've been following along with Powerstack, you've been seeing it basically every week. We cover this sort of chase of the fastest megawatt every week in Powerstack, but also we've been doing it in the Currents team as well. If you've seen our coverage of the fastest megawatt report that we published earlier this month, you'll know that this is a topic that we cover deeply in our team as well. If you haven't seen it, you can find it on currents.ai. Go give it a look, or just ping us, and happy to tell you all about it. So today on the show, is a particularly great one. If any of you know Jesse Jenkins, you know he's a deep thinker about power systems. He's the associate professor of energy systems engineering at Princeton by day, and CTO and co-founder of a company called Firma Power, also by day, and a prolific influencer on LinkedIn and Twitter by night. And he's also a dad with young kids. How does he do all this? I have no idea. He's now applying what he's learned from the Princeton ZeroLab in his work there on figuring out the cheapest, fastest way to decarbonize the energy systems in the real world. The interview hit this one really cool part where he said, hey, that fastest megawatt report that y'all did, that did not go unnoticed by our team. And so it was really fun to explore the similarities in the thesis there. So that's what we've got for today. And let us know what you think, and enjoy the show.
Hey, Mark, didn't you also go to Princeton? Did you ever know Jesse back then?
No, you can tell by my bald head that I am quite old, and I did not overlap with him. So I was gone by '07, and I think he was there quite a bit later. But yeah, and I
Got
was
it.
also in a different department back then doing molecular biology. So
Got it. Got it.
there we
All
are.
right. Well, we can both be first timers at this awesome Jesse Jenkins session. So excited for y'all to tune in.
Just to start at the high level, like where we are right now. I read an analyst report recently that where I think the direct quote was something like only 84 gigawatts of 150 something, announced data center projects will be built by 2030.
Yeah.
And I just thought that sentence was like a perfect encapsulation of where we are right now. Only 84, Seattle-sized loads are going to show up between now and the end of 4 years from now, or 4.5 years from now, right? And that's like that's a small number in that context, just given the huge scale of announced data center developments in total. And I think similar scale estimates from the folks at Grid Strategies. I think they're estimating something like 64, 65 gigawatts of data center load peak demand growth by 2030, and that's on top of another roughly 70 gigawatts of peak demand growth projected by utilities outside of the data center market for keeping up electrification of vehicles and heating, manufacturing growth, general population growth. We've tapped out, as Rob Meyer likes to remind us, we've kind of worked our way through all of the lighting efficiency gains that have been really quite substantial over the last 15 years or so, going from incandescent to CFL and CFL to LED, and now we basically have 100% LED penetration. So like that has run its course. And so kind of this period of stagnant demand growth that I've been in my entire career, right, since the mid 2000s through now, is now, decidedly over. And what's unique, I think, about the data centers, that kind of 65 to 85 gigawatts of growth, is each one is several hundred megawatts to gigawatt
Yeah.
scale. And that I do have to keep reminding myself. So we're talking about parking a city's worth of electricity demand in the space that you might find a Walmart or a Amazon, distribution warehouse. It's the most power dense user of electricity in human history, by a long shot. Far more so than aluminum, which smelting, which might be the next largest, most power dense user historically.
I guess to backstop on that, or to follow on to that. So kind of two questions. One is, do you think this demand is real? So when you're doing your modeling, right,
Yeah.
in your systems modeling, what are your assumptions, right? So do you say like, yeah, 60 looks about right, 80 looks about right, or are you pulling it way back for yourself?
So I think that range of 60 to 80 gigawatts of additional growth by the end of the decade is probably real on the demand side. The big question is whether we can actually meet that demand on the power side. And so my suspicion is that a lot of that demand is at risk of being pushed out because we're not able to build fast enough on the power side. And I think that's the other big thing we're seeing right now, and the kind of what motivated me to start Firma is we're seeing a scramble to find any available source of new capacity that can meet that growth. And the broader power sector is not set up for that right now, right? We have power infrastructure has long lead times, whether it's generation or transmission. And so all of the projects that are mature enough to build right now started development 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago, when data centers were not at all the objective, right? They were not being developed in order to serve this load. And so then anything that you want to start now, greenfield, in order to respond to this, isn't going to be ready for another 4 or 5 years. So we're already talking out to 2030 or beyond. And so that creates this really unique challenge between now and 2030, 2027, 8, 9, where you've got tens of gigawatts of load growth per year, and not, you don't have the whole system, kind of organized and working to meet that demand growth. In fact, very much you have the opposite. You have a system that was organized for flat demand and to scale wind and solar as kind of capacity resource, or sorry, to scale wind and solar as energy, and REX supply for corporate C&I customers, right? But not as capacity enabling, firm resources. So, what are data center developers doing to try to respond to that? Well, you can see several different trends. I mean, they used to just go to the utility and say, hey, I got 50 megawatts. Can you connect me? And they'd say, sure, we'll connect you in 18 months and, go ahead. And we'll just add you into our broader, demand, and we'll find supply for you. Well, now you're showing up with, 500, 800, 1,000 megawatts of request, and the data, the utility, especially the smaller mid-sized ones, like rural co-ops that might have a peak demand of, 2 gigawatts or something, or 1.5 gigawatts. They're saying, well, I can give you 50 or 100 megawatts, but the rest is up to you to figure out. So that strategy doesn't work anymore. And now you have people scrambling to find alternatives. And in some cases, large utilities, Xcel, Duke, Southern, like they are willing to put together a large capacity procurement to support a new data center. And they might build a combined cycle gas plant or two, or, in case of Xcel and Google, put together a portfolio of wind and solar and storage to support that load. But the vast majority of utilities, once you get down out of the sort of biggest, maybe 6 or 8, are not in a good position to do that. And so you see, either because the market and institutions don't make it easy to transact like that in non-vertically integrated markets like PJM, or because of their scale and size, that just simply they're not, set up to pull in 5 gigawatts of new supply, right, in a short period of time.
It sounds like that old bank saying, like they're that old saying, like if I owe the bank $1,000, it's my problem. If I owe the bank $1 billion, it's the bank's problem, right? So
yeah, the scale is just a whole nother scale here. So you see this, recent push, I think, for behind the meter, or even islanded gas in the near term, and then maybe this notion of nuclear in the long term. Kind of gas now, nuclear later, seem to be the kind of general response to that challenge when it emerged, about a year ago or 18 months ago.
Well, let me stop you there, because I think that's actually a really interesting, pivot here. Because for us as well, we've been tracking a lot of this data center capacity that's getting announced. We've also been tracking a lot of the clean firm power, especially more advanced clean firm power that's been announced on the nuclear and geo side. And we just put out this report a couple weeks ago called the fastest megawatt, really looking at, clean firm power that's actually available, but looking at it from a speed standpoint. And what we found is that the speediest clean firm power that has kind of gone unnoticed is actually solar and storage that's already deep in the ERCOT queue, so has the interconnection agreement. Whereas I think a lot of the attention right now has been focused on, nuclear fusion, SMRs, advanced geothermal,
Stuff
which are
that
great solutions.
I love to see, but
very
are not
much post
absolutely
2030.
not a solution. Yeah, exactly.
And we
So,
just did this analysis as well that those that are going public, Firma's amazing, but they have 140K in actual revenue. So yeah, where do you kind of see speed in the clean firm power landscape?
So you nailed it. I mean, we did not go unnoticed for my co-founders and I at Firma Power. That is exactly the thesis for our company. Is, when we started seeing people announce deals for, restarting 3 Mile Island for $125 a megawatt hour all in or whatever it is, or, going, and backing next generation nuclear projects that won't get delivered for another, 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
Or our friends at Firma, which are, great. I've done a ton of work with them over the years, from when they were like a 5-person team through now in my research group at Princeton. But they're not going to scale to more than, if we're lucky, a gigawatt probably by 2030, right? As they scale up from first of a kind to nth of a kind. But if you look at what's in the queue, right, the stuff that did get started 4 or 5 years ago, it was almost all wind, solar, and storage. Yeah. You have, 98% of what's in the queue is clean resources. They just weren't thrown into that queue with data centers in mind. And so you're exactly right. The fastest way to get something on the grid in the near term is to look to a project that is already deep in the development cycle and is already 3-4 years through that process. The problem we're trying to solve with Firma Power is that those wind, solar, and storage resources are scattered about, right, in places where you might have had a good land position for an individual solar project or an individual wind project, where you were developing them with an eye towards, in the case of solar and wind in particular, a volumetric PPA for energy and RECs, not a capacity enabling, transaction. And across a bunch of different developers' pipelines, where the right move as a developer is actually to diversify your risk by spreading out across a wide geography instead of putting all of your resources in one geography. Well, if you're trying to support a gigawatt scale data center, what you probably need is somewhere on the order of 3 gigawatts of total wind, solar, and storage supply in the same general area, or at least deliverable across the grid to the location of the data center. And it's what we found is that it just doesn't exist in one developer's book, right? You don't, even the big guys like NextEra and Invenergy, they very rarely will they have all of the right resources in the right place coming online at the right time to, exclusively support a data center from their development queue. And what that leaves is a pretty complicated gap on it, both an analytical and contractual front. And those are the two pieces that we're really trying to tackle. So one is, what are the resources that collectively can serve a data center? Wind and solar resources are variable resources. They are not generally good sources of firm capacity, especially not on their own. Their effective load carrying capacity, or whatever the term is for the various markets, their accredited capacity that they generate is a fraction of their nameplate capacity, and that's changing over time, because as solar penetration increases, the time when you need the most firm capacity shifts from the late afternoon into the evening, for example, and so their value goes down. Same with storage, which has a lot of capacity value in the near term, but the more storage you add, the more you flatten the peak, and the longer the duration you need to maintain the next effective megawatt of substitution. It's actually an effect that my research group pointed out in one of the first kind of papers on the value of energy storage.
Oh, that's fascinating. I never thought about that.
In 2014.
Marginal.
Yeah. So way back in 2014, we published one of my top most cited papers now, which is on the value of energy storage in a kind of low carbon grid, and saw this very steep kind of linear decline in the marginal value, which was driven by by that effect, and also by the fact that it's an arbitrage play, and the more people who buy low, the higher the low price gets, and the more people who sell high, the lower the high price gets. So you're always going to arbitrage away that arbitrage. But there is still a lot of capacity value there when you aggregate them all up. And so what we're trying to do is basically, and what we have done, I should say, is develop a proprietary set of software based on some of the research that we've done at ZeroLab, and state-of-the-art power system or power flow modeling tools that can anywhere in the grid identify the mix of resources that are in development, real tangible assets that are coming down the pipe that collectively can supply the full accredited capacity stack that a data center needs to energize 200 megawatts, 500 megawatts, 1,000 megawatts, whatever the load ramp is over time. and to demonstrate to the utility and to the RTO under whatever rules and definitions they require that that load is actually physically supportive of that supply can physically support the load. So it's deliverable across the grid under whatever deliverability rules the local jurisdiction applies, which varies a bit from place to place.
Right.
And so that's the first challenge, is like you can't just go pick any old solar and storage and wind resource and say, all right, good, now we have a portfolio, we're done. There's quite a bit of analytical complexity to figuring out what portfolios solve the problem.
What is then your approach? So how, do you call them up and say, hey, your profile fits what we're looking for here. Would you like to be part of this portfolio? How does that work?
That's right. Yeah, so then that's the second piece, which is contractually. Once you've actually identified the, say, 5 or 6 projects, maybe 8, that collectively are needed to power that data center, how do you actually pull all that into a single transaction and make sure all the trains come in at the same time or on the right schedule to actually support the load ramp schedule that the data center has? And that's the other piece that we specialize in at Firma, is managing that commercial complexity. And so what we do is offer a single contract to the data center, or sleeve through the utility to the data center, for all of the capacity and then whatever form of energy they want, whether it's an annual, volumetric contract or some kind of hedged shaped profile, right? We can deliver different products. And then behind that single contract, we are contracting with or acquiring the 5, 6, 7, 8 different projects that are needed to deliver that portfolio, which might come from 4 or 5 different developers. And so some of those projects we do strategic M&A, and we purchase those projects pre NTP, and we bring them through the contracting, secure the offtake and bring them through development. Others, we bring the offtake to the table, and so that allows an independent power provider, a developer, to then proceed to close development on their or make final investment decisions on one of their pipeline assets, and then we'll bundle those owned assets with the PPA assets into a full portfolio that we can sell through to the data center. And so those kind of 2 big pieces are I think where when we looked at the market and we said, why is nobody doing this other than, say, Google kind of painstakingly assembling these portfolios themselves? That our realization was that it's not easy. It's easy conceptually. It's complicated in practice to find the right resources. It's hard to contract and transact because no one developer has the whole portfolio in one place. And you need a platform that can reliably and scalably tackle those 2 problems in order to make this a truly viable near-term option and kind of capitalize on that speed to power promise that you were talking about.
So I think that's super fascinating, because I think to recap or summarize the model here, there's almost 2 aspects to this. There's the actual analytics layer of how you analyze the relevant projects that can build a portfolio to meet the capacity required. Because to your point, going project by project, especially from a renewables and storage standpoint, doesn't quite get you there. And then there's the actual, how do you then deploy that knowledge into the value chain? And that question I was going to ask is do you intend to be more of a developer's style play, or do you intend to be more of a, software analytics, marketplace contracting play? So it's interesting to hear kind of both sides of that.
I'd say our thesis right now is that a hybrid entity is going to be the fastest and most scalable at actually delivering what we need. Because again, it's difficult to build out your own portfolio, of all owned assets at a particular location that's all going to come to scale or come to market at the same time, especially in this near-term window, right? If we wanted to start greenfield and say, I'm going to go just build you a big campus, right, which is what Intersect did, in a particular location, I'm going to build all the resources myself, and they're all going to, be at the same point of interconnection. You can do that. There are a few places in the country where you have the land actually to do that all in one place, but that is an option. Intersect is doing that, and they, obviously prove that value with their acquisition, by Google. But if you're not starting greenfield, it is, I think, impractical to think you're going to pull the entire portfolio together as owned pipeline. Again, even the largest developers have a hard time doing that in any one location, starting from their current pipeline. So we will, we believe that the first place to start is what are the right resources to do the job. And then we're flexible about whether we want to deploy capital to buy those assets and complete them, or whether we want to contract with a third party and bundle that into an aggregate PPA that we sell through on the other side. And there's value in both of those activities. And so we're setting up the company to be able to execute on both of those.
And I Fascinating. And I do have to ask, because I think a lot of what we've been seeing in this space as well, ever since, the OBBBA came out, is there has been a bit of a fallout in renewables development. You saw a lot of the PE firms come in and acquire a lot of these IPPs and developers, AES, BlackRock being, kind of the lighthouse example of that. Is this an opportunity to also, buy, acquire, procure some assets that might be also on the cheap?
Yeah, there's definitely opportunities in the market with projects changing hands, especially pre-final decision, pre-NTP development assets, where unless you have good line of sight to an offtake agreement, they're probably not going to proceed. And they may have been initially developed with a certain assumption about what the market looked like that doesn't hold today.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of assets that will, finally got their queue their queue back, or their interconnection request out of the queue, and it's a lot higher than they expected, or they, are unable to pivot to where the current market is, or they just want to free up cash flow to go move on to the next strategic priority. And I think all of those create opportunities that we're seeing in the market to acquire projects that are useful as anchors to a broader portfolio.
Pivoting slightly, this is awesome. Pivoting ever so slightly, like what is your pitch, or what is the rationale you're using or thinking you're using about how this model juts up against companies that are saying, like, you know what, I'm just going to buy gas, and treat it as a bridge fuel or not? How do you think about that? How do you think about the gas versus this model?
Yeah, so a few things. I mean, one is there just aren't enough gas assets to meet the demand on their own. So,
Fair.
Partly it's just an observation that like the market needs more solutions and we're not necessarily directly competitive. Although probably in people's heads, the economic kind of substitute in their head is a gas plant. So we try to develop portfolios that can price competitively against the cost of new capacity from gas, once you net out the value of the energy and the RECs that they also produce, which a gas plant, produces some energy, but not as much because it has a high marginal cost. And, obviously isn't producing any clean energy attributes that are valuable. So, we are trying to price competitively against gas, and we can do that in large swaths of the country. But the reality is that usually people come to us, or we're able to develop portfolios in places where gas is, not a viable option, or at least not for the full portfolio. The other thing I would say is, the public sentiment against data centers has turned sour very quickly, as I'm sure you all have seen. Some polls saying 70% of Americans now disapprove of AI and disapprove of data center development. And, there's a lot of different things wrapped up in that number, including, just a lot of broad market anxiety about what AI means for the future of jobs and the economy. But it can't help to say, especially because most people are not building large, efficient combined cycles. They're building dozens of smaller combustion turbines on trucks or reciprocating engines or, other things like that. It can't help to show up in a community and say, I'm going to build 40 small combustion turbines without pollution control that are designed to run occasionally as backup generation, but I'm going to run them 8760 every hour of the day. And it's going to sound like a fleet of 100 semi-trucks idling in your backyard.
Yep. My parents actually live
now becoming the biggest, smog forming polluter in the Memphis area, for example, in the case of the Colossus facility. XAI did that, right? So, yeah.
My parents live in Data Center Alley, right? And there's a proposal up for 3 miles away from their house, this new one that has, I think, 80 diesel gen sets as a backup. Yeah. My question,
at least, those are backups, so they do have to run occasionally to make sure that they operate, but they're not, at least 5 times a year. Run a few hours of the year. The problem is the islanded behind the meter gas play, which is exactly what XAI pioneered at Colossus, much to their benefit. I mean, they're renting it for $2 billion a month right now, right? To Claude and to Anthropic and Google, because they have the capacity, right? So that model looks very lucrative if you can pull it off, but I do think from a social license perspective, there's not a long runway there to that strategy. And then I think the other thing that we're saying is, it might seem difficult at first to connect to the grid, but obviously there are huge benefits to having the reliability of grid service as opposed to your own, I wouldn't even call it a microgrid anymore, like your own city scale utility that has to supply all your own on-site demand. There's a lot of operational complexity there, and that drives a lot of need for redundancy, which also drives up the cost of that solution higher than you might think, with because you're not using a half of the capacity at any one time for backup. And there are big chunks of the country where you can get the transmission interconnection. What you need is to be able to bring your own capacity on the supply side. And so we, again, we're open to, we drive creative solutions to on-site power, whether that's storage or even gas used in a flexible interconnection mode, which is something that we also did work out at ZeroLab, where instead of saying, I'm going to connect 400 megawatts of behind the meter gas because I'm worried about how long it's going to take to get interconnection, you instead say, well, I might connect 400 megawatts of data center. The utility tells me I can serve 200 megawatts of that with firm capacity without triggering transmission upgrades. The other 200 megawatts might trigger a transmission upgrade, but if you're willing to be fully curtailable, as in you're willing to step in and produce all your own power, curtail your demand when we need you to, we can build you a 400 megawatt substation, and you can connect that full 400 megawatts to the grid. It's just that 200 megawatts of that is going to have to be interruptible.
Yeah.
In that case, you can run an on-site gas plant at very low capacity factor just when needed to relieve those local transmission constraints. And once you've done that, or even if you have a full firm service, you now have access to a much broader geography of the kind of full region of grid deliverable resources across the region. And that can be quite large depending on where you are. I mean, Northern Virginia is a really hard one, right? That's so oversaturated, it's hard to get any additional capacity into that region.
Yeah.
But most of the rest of the places where data center development is happening, there's a large catchment of deliverable resources out there. And so as soon as you tap into that, you also have a much more competitive landscape, because now you have a lot more options available than just what you can build physically locate on site next to your data center.
Let me ask you two quick, what do you think questions then on that? So the first is on gas. Back to gas. Is we hear bridge fuel, bridge solution nowadays has become popular again. I've heard this one before, right? Back in the 2010s, that was always the thing. That's the first one. The second one is the flexibility. We've seen your work, from Duke, et cetera, that says, hey, there's capacity there for the taking. But does your gut say, people are actually doing it? Either of those things. Is gas a bridge? Is flexibility, people actually going for it?
Yeah, great question. So on the first one, gas is a kind of bridge to interconnection in this case. They say, I'm going to do these small turbines now and operate behind the meter, and just until the utility brings me my grid connection. Okay, I mean, that's nice to say at the city hall, but think about where we are in the market right now. If demand for compute remains robust and power capacity is the gating bottleneck, the proposition for somebody, say they connect a 400 megawatt data center now, it's all behind the meter. And then 3 years from now, the utility says, great, I've now got your interconnection. You now have 400 megawatts of grid connection. That data center operator now has two choices. I can take those 400 megawatts of gas turbines that I just built, a few years ago, and I can idle them or turn them into a very low utilization rate resource. Or I can just take that 400 megawatts of new grid connection, double the size of my data center, and keep operating my 400 megawatts of gas plants behind the meter.
Yeah.
Which do you think is the stronger economic case? I mean, maybe they can move the turbine somewhere else, but the argument is going to be keep using those gas turbines and just double the size of your capacity. And so I'm very skeptical that those resources will ever shift into a kind of backup role unless that's what they were intended for at the beginning. Maybe in the long run, like if data center demand finally tapers off and we build enough capacity that we have redundancy, then maybe they'll move into that mode. But at least as long as the load ramp remains strong, you're just going to have a strong incentive to keep piling more demand on as soon as you get your grid connection. So that's my take on that. And I think it's worth everybody being pretty clear about that dynamic. Again, when you see the value of compute being, $1 billion per month for 150 megawatts of capacity at Colossus, the calculus is pretty clear.
Yeah.
So then on the on flexible interconnection side, it is a hard one. There is a ton of potential there. We are seeing some constructs emerge like SPPs, Hills and Hilga, pairing of large loads and large generators in a kind of joint interconnection process where they don't have to be like right on top of each other, but they have to be within a couple substations away. That is in some ways a route to enacting that kind of solution, where you have a generator that's sort of there to make sure that it's supplying the data center with locally available generation that doesn't lead to broader network power flows that could lead to constraints. But the big challenge I think we've run into is that many utilities, like the way utilities do interconnection studies right now, they don't actually run a kind of hour by hour power flow simulation for a whole year, or say a whole 10 different possible weather years, to determine what the operational profile of an on-site resource would have to be in order to really reliably be a substitute for transmission upgrades. Instead, what they do is run for probably 2 seasonal cases, maybe under a couple of different load planning cases, transmission planning cases, and then they run a bunch of contingencies, right, for N-1 failures that they might have to plan for. But those are snapshots in time. Those are single moments where they think the grid is going to be under stress and they want to make sure they have local capacity. And so while they might be able to tell you in that one moment, I need 300 megawatts of local dispatchable capacity, they can't tell you whether they need it for 4 hours or 16 hours, and whether they need it that one moment or they need it 15 times during the year. And that makes it pretty hard for you to size your on-site resource. So I think that's a key bottleneck that is, I think, it's making it difficult to reliably use anything other than a fully dispatchable gas plant to do that kind of on-site substitutability. Because if you don't know if it's going to be a 4-hour event or a 40-hour event, you can't say with confidence my lithium-ion battery is going to do the job.
Right.
What about your
so
energy dome or your form?
I was going to say the L does.
Yeah, I mean, form would probably do the trick, right? 150 hours or 100 hours will probably do the trick. But that's other than very long duration, multi-day storage or gas, it is a little bit of a risk right now. Just because of lack of data. I don't think the actual, like when we did this study with at ZeroLab with Camus and Encord actually looked at 5 different locations or 6 different locations, I think, in Pennsylvania utilities territory, real power flow cases, and did the full hourly 8760 modeling for that case, and found that at most of them there was plenty of flexible headroom that could be addressed by on-site storage. And only 1 or 2 of those sites needed like 30 hours of dispatch that you might want a gas plant or some other long duration storage for. So what we do, I think, need is utilities and RTOs to start to invest in a more dynamic understanding of what the grid constraints look like, and that can enable us to expand the toolkit of on-site resources, whether that's compute flexibility like Emerald AI is doing, which I'm an advisor of, or it's cooling system flexibility, which is another area that we're doing a lot of research at ZeroLab on, or whether it's on-site, power storage solutions. You have to really kind of know what you're trying to solve for when you're solving for that flexible interconnection solution. And we don't really have a good answer from the utilities on that right now in most cases.
That's a good point, because those are a lot of the solutions we're looking at in trucking as well, but it's really the kind of sizing and data question. Yeah. Last thing to gut check you on before we go into more of a close, which is, Jigger's been on open circuit, and his whole thing right now is we're trending towards more distributed compute, that we're trending to inference versus large, massive, 100 megawatt plus large loads for training. What's your take on that? Do you think there's still going to be a lot of these mega projects?
I see zero market evidence of his claim other than STEM trying to put little ones in your backyard. Yeah. I see no evidence of that, and massive demand for the biggest effing data center you can get us. That seems to be the message from everybody we're talking to. We might come in and say, hey, I can give you, 200 megawatts by 2028, ramping to 500 megawatts by 2029. They say, great, can you do 5 gigawatts? So I don't know what he's talking about. Maybe he's seeing different signs and talking to different folks. And I do think there is a real role for that kind of edge compute, that we're going to get smarter about the types of inference that you can put on my phone, right? Like you can put a little mini model that knows a lot of stuff, but not everything on my phone. And then maybe you'll be able to actually run that inference locally and then, say, oh, I don't know the answer. Let me think about that for a minute and kick it out to the cloud and go to the big data center to consult the giant mega brain model. I'm sure there's lots of innovation like that. Anytime you have $1 trillion trying to get deployed into a bunch of physical constraints, there's going to be a lot of creative solutions that come to the fore. But what I'm talking to the hyperscalers, and we talk to all of them, or the data center developers that are trying to anticipate what they need, everybody's still talking about hundreds of megawatt scale, gigawatt scale, as big as you can get.
It's still
maybe it'll be a mix.
And big.
Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit like the whole distributed energy resources phenomenon in general, where like the
Mm.
world will be more distributed than it is today, because today it's very not distributed. So yes, there could be a huge growth opportunity for distributed compute, just like there was a huge growth opportunity for distributed solar and storage. And yet we still have a largely centralized grid with largely centralized assets and big network wires, because that still makes sense in a lot of cases. And so I think that's probably what's going to happen with compute as well, is we're still going to have a very large central backbone compute infrastructure at gigawatt scale. We may also have some edge computing that's distributed about that helps augment that and reduce latency and expand the available pool of compute. But I don't think we're going to go to an entirely distributed world anytime soon.
Promise of DERs. It's always right around the corner.
It's always coming up.
I worked on the utility of the future study at MIT from 2014 to 2016. So 10 years ago now that study came out, and it's still the future. It is starting to become real. I mean, we are seeing folks like SparkFun and Voltus and Base Power and others actually put that business model into practice and then be able to aggregate gigawatt scale or hundreds of megawatt scale distributed solutions and bring them to bear. So that's really exciting. It's finally the future maybe has finally arrived, but still that's we're talking about 80-ish gigawatts of demand by 2030. It's still just going to be a piece of the puzzle, a piece that we do turn to at Firma as part of our kind of broader portfolio set, but it is a piece of the portfolio, not the full solution.
I mean, sometimes things arrive. Like I was studying EGS in 2007.
Yeah.
And one of my friend's dad was an engineer on Fenton Hill, back in the 70s. Yeah. So things happen, but
sometimes it takes a long time and then arrives all at once. So yeah.
For sure. So we got 3 minutes left. Just want to ask you a final question. Like,
sure.
What is the thing that you feel people are just getting wrong? That you see out in the market that you haven't mentioned yet in the call here, but what is what I'm teasing out here is what was your most contrarian take these days? That you just think people are just missing.
That's a good question.
Besides the three that you've already had.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think, Firma's thesis is itself a contrarian take, although I think more and more people are starting to realize it. I mean, you put out that report, Kim, that shows this is the fastest way to go. And, Google's obviously been doing that. Some of the larger IPPs are trying to put portfolios together like this around their own assets. So, it was a contrarian take maybe a year ago when we started Firma, and maybe it's becoming more of a established take, which is good because that's what we need to do our job and transact as a business. But
still not a crowded market,
beyond that,
right?
But it's a crowded market, and I do think the conventional wisdom still is that you're going to do gas now and nuclear later, and I just think that that's missing a huge scalable solution. I mean, we can deliver tens of gigawatts of clean, firm capacity with wind, solar, and storage now in the next 3-4 years. In addition to pulling forward demand for things like nuclear and geothermal in the 2030s, we need to be investing in those assets and that reality now. And so that's, again, what motivated me to start Firma with Scott and Brent, is to try to actually show people this is doable at scale, and to make it an easy button solution for data center developers and hyperscalers, so that it is easy and quick for them to transact on, and not something they have to spend 2 years themselves putting the deal together, because they're trying to build so much capacity so fast that they don't have time to do that. And so that's, I think, another piece of the value proposition is just, here's one contract you can sign for the whole thing. We did all the work already.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's
we
always
wanted to be the easy button.
Love it. Well, that's a
hard
great
work for
way,
us, easy for our customers.
Exactly. The Staples easy button for clean from power for data centers.
That's it. Firma Power. That's it. The Staples easy button solution.
That's the tagline. Yep. Last thing before we close, which is, what can our audience, what can our community do for you? If you have a call to action, whether it be for the community, for how to think about this space, or even specifically for yourself or Firma, how can we help? How can our audience help?
Yeah. I mean, maybe just taking a very high level step back. I mean, we talked about this earlier, but the sort of 70% disapproval rating for AI, I think is a real sign that we're just we as in the broad, data center and power community are basically doing it wrong, right? That is a big red warning sign that the way development is proceeding right now, both of the technology and the data centers and probably the power that serves them, when we consider these, polluting small gas generators I talked about, are not doing the job. We are, the social license, whatever existed, is rapidly tattering and falling away.
Mhm.
And so I guess, if I would say like a broad message to the whole community that you're trying to speak to is like, we really need to be smarter and more careful about how we proceed with building out this industry in a way that continues to secure social license. I mean, not continues, rebuild social license, to
Yeah.
be fair. I mean, you have to have a better pitch than, we're going to build 60 jet engines in your backyard, run them all the time, take all your water, and then power data centers whose job is to take all your jobs. Like that's not a good pitch, right? So, I think a clean, quiet energy solution like Firma is delivering, of offsite, renewables and
Yeah.
maybe some on-site storage, and like that is a small piece of that social license question because it solves at least that kind of air pollution and noise pollution concern from the gas generation. But like that is just a small slice of the puzzle. And if the broader industry is not sharing the wealth more broadly with the local communities that are affected and broadly with the public writ large, so they see some broad benefit from AI other than that they can, chat with Claude or make cat videos. Like, we have to be able to create a stake in the AI future for a broader swath of the public and for the communities that are directly bearing the impacts from data center development. And that's just not routinely happening right now. And so I think, we're starting to see signs that people are recognizing that. You hear some of the CEOs of the AI labs saying, hey, we need to think about how we maybe cut people in on the profits here, or Bernie Sanders and Trump both saying like maybe we want to start a sovereign wealth fund that taxes these entities and reinvest it in America. I mean, that's a great idea, I think, to give people a stake. But it also comes down to the local development strategies that data center developers are pursuing, and they've done it in very secretive ways in many cases, and with polluting generators, and without a lot of local buy-in or local contributions, with a lot of tax breaks that I think again undercut the story that there's something here for the broader public. So yeah, that'd be my broad message is like, we got to take a step back. We, the broad we that's trying to build the clean energy and the data center and energy future here. And I think rebuild that social license with a new development paradigm and a new way to share in the upside of the AI economy.
I love that. I think that is a great way to close. We have to rebuild the social license with the Staples easy button for clean firm capacity. Tagline, Firma Power.
Yes.
Jesse, as you spoke, as you gave that last line, the sun shone through the trees, golden
perfect,
hour.
Yes.
It's great.
Yeah, it's good lighting here.
Amazing. Amazing.
Yeah, folks want to learn more about us.
They
can head to firmapower.com and drop us a line there if you're a data center developer or a hyperscaler power team, or listening to this and want to get in touch. We'd love to talk to you. Or if you're an IPP with assets looking for offtake, we'd love to talk to you too.